Brian Smith, and just before we get started, I want to thank everyone for showing up and taking your time out of the day to be here. I know you all have things to do, but I appreciate you doing this for me. So, the topic of our speech today is I'm asking you to consider the inverse correlation between crime and education. Now, we'll also acknowledge that poverty levels have a relationship with both these things, and that improving our system could, in fact, save lives and make our country more competitive in the global arena. Now, to put you in the right mindset, first let me tell you about a man I met a long time ago. His name is Babra Edwards. He had a long criminal background before I even met him, but he was smart and well-spoken, so I hired him when nobody else would because I saw that he had potential. Now, his biggest drawback was the fact that he needed to escape his past. Now, because his life story kind of reminds me of a scene from The Godfather 3 where Michael Corleone goes, you know, just when I thought I was getting out, they pulled me back in. And that was basically his life and the life of a lot of other people like him. So, getting to know him is how I became familiar with a story that's more common than we'd like to think. Now, Babra had been raised in a mostly single parent family in a very poor area of downtown San Bernardino. And since he was having what he perceived as limited options as a teenager, it wasn't long before a very violent street gang called the Pimps, Players, Hustlers, and Gangsters saw him. Now, Babra saw his future as having very limited potential, and so he joined in, and it wasn't long before, given his status, his drive, and his intelligence, he rose up through the ranks pretty rapidly and became the shot caller. Now, pluses and minuses on this. One, Babra was making a lot of money as a young man. Two, this has an effect on not just him and his personal little community there, as a whole, but it also has a ripple effect out through the other communities, because in 2005, in a drive-by shooting against a rival gang, a very, very innocent 11-year-old girl was killed. So not just is it his life that's affected by this whole system, but it's the lives of others that are affected as well. So hopefully that makes a little sense. Now, like I said before, Babra, by the time I'd met him, been out of prison several times, and after a parole violation that's happened sequentially, he will probably be in there for the rest of his life. And at the time of that shooting of that little girl, keep in mind, he wasn't even the guy who was in the car, he didn't pull the trigger or anything like that, but because of his connections, it rippled through, and he's the one who did some time for that effect in prison as well. So, an even worse part of this whole system is, this whole little thing that's going on, is that now his son, Babra's back in prison, and his son, who's getting of that age, is now following those very same footsteps. So it's definitely an effect on everyone. Now, for Babra, the gang was merely business. And being aggressive is what was done to eliminate competition. Just like any business model, we want to eliminate competition. And in that world, that meant going out and doing what was necessary to get rid of that competition. But as I said in the beginning, Babra was very smart. He speaks well, and he's obviously a natural leader. That's what rose him up through the ranks. So if he had other options as a child, his life and the lives of many, many others, for instance, like the family and community of that little girl who got killed, would have been vastly different. Now, while there's no one single solution, increasing the revenue for our education system could improve the life of not just one person, but as I was saying, it could affect a lot of different people. And we need to uncover realistic methods of giving large numbers of people a better chance to pursue that environment, to pursue that goal. So the current system that we have that we've accepted over the course of time, it's just the way things are done, really has some pretty big cracks in it that we need to kind of think about how to improve. Now, to provide some measure of credibility to this talk, let me give you some more background. I've met people like Babra lots of times. I've seen how downtrodden their communities are where they reside. And the other fact is that many people tend to surrender to living in that environment. They get used to being there and they stay there forever because they think they have no chance at doing anything else. But there are some bright spots out there. Well over a decade ago, I met a lady named Dr. Mildred Henry. She was a very smart lady who founded what's called the PAL Center of San Bernardino. And this was like a safe haven that provided education, personal mentorship on the grounds, and it actually employed employment services for its students after they graduate. And one of the cool things about this was, by the time I met her, she was kind of like the grandmother of the area, but she created this little bubble there in San Bernardino where where even though people from different gangs and different parts of the neighborhood would go there, and out anywhere else they would duke it out or kill each other, inside that little zone was this safety area where they could actually learn and go on. Now, when she invited me to come to that school, it was because, you know, Dr. Henry always had a little motivation that she could see from point A to point Z and connect the dots. I happen to have a little more connections in the world. And so while I was there, she took me a tour of the campus, and we saw that some of the buildings needed improvement. So together we worked and we approached the California State Senate, and because we wanted to put in just an instantaneous little spotlight on this one little area and show that if we can do something here, imagine if we grew that topic and made it expanded. So we gathered, in addition to going to the Senate, we gathered several contractors who were willing and able to donate some material and manpower, and we improved the buildings on that campus for those kids. Because when I first walked through, some of those places were missing simple things like steps. You go into the classroom and there was no heating and cooling. The floors look like this. So the kids are in that environment trying to learn, but they're really in that environment trying to learn. It's a tough situation. So for these efforts, along with a few other projects, I've been getting a certificate of recognition from the California State Senate. A few years after that, as this kind of progressed in my mind, I served on the Workforce Investment Board for the city of San Bernardino. And I've also done some statistical research on this entire topic that we're going to discuss today, where I compiled 30 years of data on the topic of how crime, poverty, and education are all interrelated. Now, to give you an idea, one, about education, and two, that how math is a great thing, this 30 years of data that I gathered up enabled even somebody like me to write a formula that actually predicts what's going on. Keep in mind, this is 30 years of data compressed into this, right? Where we created a formula and an equation that will tell you, if you give me inputs, such as the level of education in anybody in one given area, the level of poverty, I can predict reasonably rapidly what the level of violent crime is going to be in that world. So this is something that even somebody like I can develop. So it's something that, imagine if we had great scientific minds and people dialing things in to get something like that done. And this will show you, here's what I've got as a plot. If you take the data that I input into my system and bring out, and you'll see here, these are the predicted murders and non-negligent homicides. There's my prediction line, and here's where the actuals are. So yeah, there's some outliers, but eventually you can get pretty close to actually knowing how things are going to work based on what your inputs are.
That's crazy.
So it's not that hard. Learning is a good thing, and math is even wonderful. So today I'm going to give you an overview of facts about economic stressors and how they produce violence. Show there's an inverse correlation between education and violent crime. And we're also going to explore the notion about how an increase in financing for education would deliver a substantial return for our economy by enabling some of these communities to become more productive. Now, cost is not going to be offset in the long run. There'll be a return on investment because as societal production increases over time, guess what? The need for things like funding and other social programs would diminish. So once again, it's an inverse relationship we're talking about. If you increase here, this one goes down. So eventually, guess what? We do better for everyone. So let's begin by recognizing one of the primary roots behind violent crime. And keep in mind, some of these things I'm going to tell you are going to sound really, really obvious, but what we're exploring here is something that has gone on for centuries, and it's something that the world as a whole can't seem to get their heads around. So that's why I'm hoping that when you walk out here today and you go, oh, hopefully that still gives your mind a little thought process for things that could be done if we truly try. So one of the primary roots behind violent crime is obviously money. That's the kicker for everything. So now if we drive through these poor urban neighborhoods, we tend to assume automatically that it's a crime-ridden area. Just like I know that probably for most of us, I remember when I was a kid, if the parents take a wrong turn off the road, suddenly like, oh, kids, roll up the windows, lock the doors, don't look at anybody, look down, don't talk, just keep your mouth shut and go. And you hope to get out of there as soon as possible. Because we automatically assume we drive those poor neighborhoods, they're crime-ridden. Well, there's a general acceptance that lower income and combined with lower education status have greater likelihood to produce crime. And this is not a new idea. Back in 1943, a man named Albert Hobbs wrote a paper on this subject and stated, for more than a century, students, and keep in mind, more than a century as of 1943, show you how far back this kind of research goes. For more than a century, students of social conditions in Europe and America have investigated the relationship between criminality and economic fluctuations. Most of them have concluded that the volume of crime is influenced by economic fluctuations. So in other words, as the economy does this, so does crime. That would be a direct relationship we're talking about. Now, also, when there's been a significant downturn in the economy, this obviously increases the number of families facing poverty. So when the economy goes down, more people get poor. This corresponds to an even greater number of violent crimes. In a research conducted by Karen Parker and Matthew Pruitt at the University of Texas, they noted that when people who had been reasonably stable fell into poverty, they do not have the same acceptance of this outcome as described by the term social institutions. Now, social institutions is just a nice way of saying that people who've been poor for a very long period of time, they have become accustomed to and accepting of this fate. So when you fall from here to here suddenly, that's when the crime skyrockets, because suddenly you just can't deal with that. And we can extrapolate this notion to say that children who were raised in violent communities will have, where street smarts are more important than formal education, they will have a greater tendency to accept this whole concept because they were raised there. Born and raised there is the way it's always been. Grandpa's here, my mom's here, my dad's here. This is just the way life is. So they become very, very accepting of this. Now, as provided in the United Nations study, during periods of economic stress, incidents of robbery may double, and homicide and vehicle theft obviously increase as well. And the United States Census Bureau states that in 2018, there were 38 million people in this country living in poverty. Poverty. Not kind of hard, poverty. 38 million people. Now, we should remember that some of that 38 million people are children who are coming up in this world. Now, on a slightly positive note, between 2017 and 2018, there was a 1.2% decrease in the number of children living in poverty. It went from 17.4 to 16.2%. Children living in poverty. Now, while a decrease of 1.2 is good, it's not good, it's okay, it happened, but we should still remember that there are 16.2% of children living in this country who live in poverty. Now, a lot of people gloss over the 0.2, but I want to point out when you're dealing with that kind of big number, that 0.2 is actually our entire community here. You could change that over into children living in poverty, and there would still be leftover children living in poverty. That 0.2 matters a lot. That's why I stress it so much, because it's such a big number. So now that we've taken a moment to examine the relationship between poverty and crime, let's look for a second how education can reverse this process. Because research has shown that criminals, here's another obvious one for you, criminals tend to have lower education as a whole. In a study that was published in the Journal of Economic Perspectives, Richard Freeman wrote, the demographics of the criminal population show that those who commit crimes consist disproportionately, not even the same average, disproportionately of persons with low legitimate earnings prospects, who are the young, the less educated, and those who would test score low. So it's at least plausible then that these characteristics are a greater limitation on the earnings that they could have in legal activities as opposed to illegal activities. So imagine this, if you're that kid in this neighborhood in San Bernardino and you're seeing two options. I can go sweat for the rest of my life over this grill flipping hamburgers and make, let's say $10 an hour, or I can go see my buddy Bob and make $5 grand this week selling little drugs in the corner. Now for young people, which way are they gonna, a lot of them are gonna drift to that way. Simply because those are their two options. You live here for the rest of my life and dying poor, and let's think about it. Kids a lot of times think that their lifespan is only about 10 years, so they're like, I'd rather live rich and die young than live forever and live poor. So at least that's what goes on in their minds. Now, another aspect of this whole thing that we need to consider is that poor urban communities tend to be tightly compressed into dilapidated apartments and housing that is just a few feet apart. So lack of money obviously means that space is limited. This is another obvious term, right? So if we combine that, the fact that we're right on top of each other in a high crime area where violence is very high, then it's very likely that a small child in that environment is either going to be victimized by violent crime or at the very least see violent crime. And we have to accept also the fact that then that this will have some factor on their psyche. It adapts them to that environment. So another even in their safe zones, most urban elementary and high schools tend to resemble prisons. And they do that for a safe way. There's guards on the premises, and they do that. I mean, it's understandably why in our current system why they do that, because they're looking to keep the staff and the students safe while they're there. Okay, but instead of accepting that as just the way things are, what if we could dream of a community where a school doesn't need guards, and where the students could actually focus on teaching, and where the teachers could focus on teaching, and the kids could come up thinking, okay, if I work hard and I have a really good learning schedule, I have a chance at this in the future. But see, right now they're not in that world. They're just going from home, which is a crappy area, to a prison, which is school for the day, and then they go back out on the streets. And it's a continuous cycle. Everybody quits caring, et cetera, and they just move on through the system. So, hard work and learning are two things that kids, if we increase the level of education for these poor communities, could improve upon. So now that we've looked at how lower education is a harbinger of crime, let's look at where we rank in the global scale, and an example of what could be done to improve our methods. Now, increased financing will lift our society to new levels of production, as I was saying before. We always say things like, we're the best, and invest in our future. But do we really mean that? In terms of education, in a 2015 Pew Center research study, only 29% of Americans rated our current system as even above average in the core groups of science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. Only 29% of Americans thought we were even decent at that. That means that 71% of Americans think that we're pretty crappy in that zone. That's something to think about too. And this is a study that's actually gone out there and done surveys and said, what do you think about our system? Well, here's where we play. So other countries are way, way ahead of us at this. And once again, given the level of interconnection in the global economy, those are our competitors in this world. Now, in the 1940s, once again going back a long time, countries like Sweden implemented a compulsory school program to reduce crime and improve their methods in their country as a whole. And it was shown in a review of those methods that were done quite recently that one additional year of schooling for these kids decreases the likelihood of conviction by 6.7% and long-term incarceration by 15.5%. Just 1 year. So now Sweden is a much smaller country and comparison data can be skewed because there's a lot of variables, but we should recognize that in 2014, if we level the playing field of population, the crime rate in the United States was 28% higher than in Sweden. That's all things being equal. 1 to 1, we're still 28% higher. We beat you on that one. We got violent crime going like crazy in our world. So while education now is not going to be argued as the only reason behind our crime rate, shouldn't we at least admit that's part of the process? That's part of the reason why we're ahead of the game in terms of crime. So now that I've told you about the possibilities for programs and how increased financing might improve our system, let's review, because I think patience is a virtue and children are our future. It's important to recognize that even if we make changes today, there's one of the problems with America. Even if we make changes today, it's going to be a few generations before we see a large-scale materialization of the results. So if we're searching for a quick fix that's going to make next week's headlines or our political agenda or whatever else for next year, that's not going to work. And that's why I think we've kind of missed the boat on this, because we always look for something now. I go through the drive-thru, I want a burger right now. Ordered 2 minutes ago, where's my burger?